The intersection of endurance sport, health, fitness, and life. Challenging conventional ideas and empowering people with the science of self-propelled motion. This is the Endurance Experience Podcast, hosted by Tony Rich.
Welcome to the Endurance Experience Podcast. This is Tony Rich. I'm going to start off by reading a quick passage. Of the 2.6 million years since our genus Homo emerged, we were hunter-gatherers for 99.5% of it, subsistence-level farmers for 0.5% of it, and industrialized for less than 0.008% of it. Our current food system is less than a century old, not nearly enough time for humans to genetically adapt to the radical changes that have occurred. Our ancient brains and bodies aren't aligned with the modern world. And many researchers believe this evolutionary mismatch is why we suffer from such high rates of lifestyle-related disorders, such as coronary heart disease, diabetes, and obesity. This was a passage from the book The Hungry Brain by Dr. Stephan Guyenet, a neuroscientist that has spent a total of 12 years in the neuroscience research world studying neurodegenerative disease and the neuroscience of adiposity or body fatness. He's an authority on the topic of obesity, and his publications in scientific journals have been cited over 2,000 times by his peers. I've been following Dr. Guyenet's work for several years now, and no matter where you land on the topic of nutrition and or obesity, you simply must read this book. I do think Dr. Guyenet brings forth the best science about this topic, and everything in the book has references to a treasure trove of the scientific body of knowledge on this subject. If you recall, recently Dr. Guyenet had a nearly 2-hour and 40-minute debate on the Joe Rogan podcast with a rival in the field by the name of Gary Taubes. Now understand that Joe Rogan has the number one podcast perennially, generally among the top 5 most viewed and most followed podcast. And the last time I looked at that podcast on YouTube, the views were approaching 1 million views. I think this is great because it raises the profile of the debate and the discussion, which I think is needed. And needless to say, it was a big win for the Endurance Experience to get Dr. Guyenet to come on, and I was very grateful he was able to lend me some of his time. I didn't go into the elements of the debate with Taubes at all on the podcast. That was by design. There was so much I wanted to cover, but I will link that debate in the show notes. I do think it was a brilliant demonstration by Dr. Guyenet on the scientific method, and also just generally raises awareness about the seriousness of the issue. I primarily talked with Dr. Guyenet on the subject matter from his book, The Hungry Brain. So we discussed the nature of the obesity problem today, and specifically why we tend to overeat in modern times, given our hunter-gatherer bodies. We talk about the evidence for the health risk of obesity, and in the same vein, I get Dr. Guyenet's opinion on movements that aim to normalize obesity and or reject the evidence of said risks in the name of various alternative social causes. we graze the concept of fad diets and discuss energy balance. And then we get into the brain, the approximately 3-pound mass of tissue in our heads, representing about 2% of our body weight, yet commands 1/5 of the total energy demand of the body. And listening to the podcast, and certainly reading The Hungry Brain, you come away with an understanding of how the brain that evolved over 600 million years to save our lives can subconsciously impact our behavior so as to influence adiposity. So, without further delay, I give you Dr. Stephan Guyenet. Dr. Stephan Guyenet, welcome to the podcast.
Good to be here. Thanks for having me.
All right. So the book is called The Hungry Brain, and it's one of the best books that I've read on this subject. Actually got the book and, went through it like wildfire. And after getting the book, I went out and then got the audio book too, because I said to myself, I got to listen to this on the go, driving and things like that. So I got both the book and the audio book. So your Northeast sales are partly due to me over here. But let's start with your education and your career background and why you decided to devote your life's work to the study of obesity.
Yeah, so as far back as I can remember, I've always been really interested in science, and the brain has always really fascinated me. And I've always also had a personal interest in diet and fitness, understanding how to maximize my physical and cognitive performance and healthy aging. And so those are all things that were interesting to me. And I ended up getting a BS in biochemistry in undergrad with the idea that I would use that as a platform to learn neuroscience. And so I went to grad school for neuroscience at the University of Washington. And at the time, I didn't really know what I wanted to focus on. And I started researching neurodegenerative disease. My advisor was Al Espada. And it was interesting work, and I learned a lot of skills, and I learned a lot about neuroscience, but we were studying a disease that is quite rare, and eventually I decided I wanted to study something that was more impactful, something that impacted more people. And so I brought together my interest in obesity and health with my interest in neuroscience, and I did a postdoc at the University of Washington studying the brain regulation of body fatness. So that was a way for me to bring together these kind of different interests in my life, the scientific interests and the personal interests. And not only was it a really good fit for me personally, in terms of my interests, but I think it was a really good fit for my audience too, because a lot of people, it's just kind of this void in the public understanding of why we eat and how our body fatness is regulated. And once I started learning about it, I started realizing that there's so much information out there that is so useful that most people are not at all aware of. We have all of these ideas circulating about what causes us to eat more or less, and what the relationship between that and body fatness is, etc. And I don't think a lot of people realize just how much information we have in the scientific community on these issues. Not to say that we have it all figured out, but we have a lot figured out. And furthermore, just the general concept that the brain is in charge of eating behavior. I mean, this should be obvious because the brain is in charge of all behaviors. The brain generates all behaviors. But even that simple basic concept was something that wasn't really coming across in the public conversation. Like, people weren't really thinking about eating behavior and body fatness as a brain-centric phenomenon. And so I had the very good fortune of being able to fill that knowledge gap in the public sphere with my book, The Hungry Brain. And honestly, in retrospect, I'm just like blown away that I was the guy who got to write the first book that kind of comprehensively addresses that issue. And so that was a wonderful opportunity for me. And yeah, so since writing the book, my career has kind of diversified. I don't have an academic appointment at this point, but I still write scientific papers sometimes. I work for an organization called GiveWell that does evaluates and recommends charities. I do some research for them and some other odds and ends. But most of it is still in the service of the connection between nutrition and calorie intake and body fatness and health.
Right. Yeah, and just piggybacking on what you were describing, there's so much information out in the public sphere, and now there's so much erroneous information. And I think getting back to what does the science say, and this book just is loaded with the science. And I'm that guy that reads the book and then actually does go into the references in the footnotes and then goes to the articles. And there's tons of that in here. So it was an amazing experience going through it. So there's so much that I want to touch on with you, and I want to start by talking about just framing the obesity problem in relationship to the last 100 years, and why this is a problem now. What is the difference, for instance, in calorie consumption now, say compared to 100 years ago, and just sort of framing that information.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the first thing to consider is that when we look at non-industrial cultures that are living in a manner more similar to how our distant ancestors lived and how humans predominantly evolved, you see that there's a lot less obesity than in today's culture. So the biological norm for human beings is not to have 38% of the population have obesity like we have in the modern United States. The biological norm is for almost everyone to be lean, with maybe a few people who are overweight, and almost no one has obesity. So something has happened clearly in our environment that has changed, that has driven us in that direction to away from the biological norms of body fatness for our species. Mm-hmm. And so that's kind of like the first thing that I want to just lay out. If we go back even just 100 years in this country, there's a lot less obesity than there is today. And the data get, of course, increasingly sparse and less reliable as we go back. But the data that we do have suggests that in the late 1800s, 1 in 17 white adult men had obesity, whereas today that's like 1 in 3, or even more than 1 in 3. So, wow. Yeah, so and we don't have data. The reason I say white adult men is because we don't have data for other demographics, but that's a comparison that we can make, and the difference is absolutely striking. So, there have been huge changes, and if we look at the development of this, basically we've been getting fatter for at least half a century, probably longer than that. It probably goes back to the 50s, the 40s, maybe even before that we really started getting fatter. Although we had a significant uptick in the 80s and 90s, particularly, where the rate accelerated. And that's what we call the obesity epidemic. And that kind of culminated in us being where we are today. And so, body fatness, body fat tissue is the primary energy storage site in the body. So if you have more energy coming in then energy leaving your body. So energy, of course, comes in via food, and it leaves via all your metabolic processes as well as your physical activity. If you have more energy coming in than is leaving, that is going to be stored in your energy storage tissue, adipose tissue, and it will get larger. And so essentially what we have to do is figure out, if we want to understand why we got fatter, we have to figure out what made us consume more and or move less. And probably both of those play some role, but I think increased consumption is the main thing. And if we look at calorie intake over the course of the last 40 years or so, we can look at it from using several different methods, and I won't get into detail unless you think your audience would be interested in me explaining that. But basically, over the last 40 years in the United States, we have gradually consumed more and more calories per day on average. The average person has increased their calorie intake, and it's pretty substantial. I'm not remembering what the exact number was, but I think it's like 180 calories a day. Mm-hmm. I have it in my book somewhere.
Yeah, I think it was somewhere close to about a couple hundred calories per day on average increase. And you think that's primarily due to more availability to processed foods?
Yeah, it's 218 calories. That's the figure. I got it right here. Mm-hmm. So, we can't run a controlled experiment of, we can't set up 100 different initial conditions for the United States and see, how fat people get in these different combinations. We can't do that experiment, so we can only kind of guess as to what caused this increase of about 218 calories to happen. But I think the most obvious culprit is the food that we're eating and the food that we're surrounded by.
Right.
So our food environment and our diet. So, food, if you look at the animal research literature, food is the most effective way to make animals fat. If you feed animals human junk food, they get super fat. Humans are eating more human junk food as time goes on, and we're being surrounded more by it, and we're being bombarded by food cues in advertising, etc. And so, I think from that perspective, it's a simple explanation, but I think that's probably where most of the explanation lies right there.
Yeah, and some of it lies on the expenditure side of the equation. We're now driving more. We have 9-to-5 jobs. We're more sedentary. We're not out washing clothes, baling hay, things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Certainly, especially if you go back really far. Mm-hmm. One of the figures I cite is that in the early 1900s, 70% of people had manual labor jobs. Right. And, whether you're working in the field, on a farm, or in a factory, without any mechanization, like anybody who's done that knows that it can be pretty physically intensive. So, anybody who's been a farmer, especially think about like, don't even have a tractor to help you. You can imagine how physically intensive that would be. So, and that was just life for 70% of people back then.
Right. Yep. And so looking at the history of humans, now you're looking at our hunter-gatherer bodies that were designed by natural selection to keep us from starving and to survive on less. Explain how that might be problematic thrust into today's environment.
Yeah, absolutely. So natural selection obviously penalizes starvation. Let's put it that way. So that is going to favor the evolution of organisms that have systems that push them to get enough calories. And, getting too many calories is usually not the issue in a natural setting. Getting enough calories is usually going to be more of the issue. They can both be issues, but insufficiency is generally more of a threat in more contexts. And, because if you starve, you're dead.
Right.
If you eat too much, you're probably not going to die. You might suffer some consequences, but you're not going to at least immediately die. So, so essentially we have these systems that push us and motivate us to get the energy that fuels our body. And these are very hardwired systems. I mean, we're talking about non-conscious, hardwired brain systems that are wired up to your digestive tract to cause your brain to be motivated by certain types of foods.
Right.
And so, and by that, I mean foods that contain certain substances. And we can talk more about that. But most of those substances are related to energy intake or calorie intake, or calorie content. So basically, your gut and your brain is crudely measuring the amount of calories in the food you're eating and causing a motivational response that drives you to consume those foods, because that is the motivational response that got your ancestors off their butts to go, hunt an ibex, or to go pick some berries, or to dig tubers, or whatever it is. If they didn't have that drive, they wouldn't have done it.
Yeah, and one of the examples that you give is sodium. That sodium is the only electrolyte that we can taste, and you think that might be because of an evolutionary reason.
Yeah, probably. So that's one sort of counterexample is the almost everything that the brain responds to in terms of secreting dopamine and causing a motivational state to occur, almost all of those things are energy-containing substances. Salt seems to be an exception to that. And so salt, we like it and we seek it in food. You can't taste vitamin B12. You can't taste riboflavin. You can't taste, magnesium, but you can taste salt. That's the only essential micronutrient that you can really distinctly taste. And so, so I speculate that it played among the micronutrients, maybe it played a particularly important role. But again, in the context of an environment that may have been very limiting of your salt intake. So maybe like if you barely get any salt in your normal diet, then it makes sense for you to be super motivated to seek salt sources.
Right. Now,
Go ahead.
And so it makes sense. It's like I always thought that a good example would be if aliens came down and they could survey the last, say, 3 million years of human life, they could survey our eating patterns. They would realize that many more people have died of starvation than actually overeating over the history of, say, 1 million years or 2 million years, wouldn't you say?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think especially if you were to adjust it based on population size.
Right. Yeah,
I mean, no question about that. I mean, just open a history book and it's full of horrible famines.
Right.
And I think it's been even worse for agriculturalists than for hunter-gatherers, because hunter-gatherers have more fallback foods. But anyway, so basically we have these motivational systems that evolved for this ancient context that our ancestors lived in and is calibrated for this ancient context. So imagine, these systems are calibrated for an environment where it's hard to get food. And so your, motivational drive is pretty high to consume these foods and these substances that sustained your ancestors. But today we're swimming in those things, but we still have that heightened drive. And so if you look at hunter-gatherer cultures, I spoke to anthropologists and they told me that hunter-gatherers, there's no taboo around stuffing themselves silly. There's no stigma around, quote unquote gluttony. That concept doesn't exist. As much as you can eat, the more the better. That's how it is in hunter-gatherer cultures, because that is actually good for them to overconsume. That actually helps them meet their goal of meeting their energy needs and being physically and reproductively competent. And so it's only in modern societies where we still have those hardwired drives, but those drives are no longer good for us, that we have started to stigmatize overconsumption. Now overconsumption is bad, and we say, you're a glutton, etc. But these are just hardwired drives that we've always had in our species that actually evolved for our benefit.
Right.
It's just that they're in a different context now.
Yeah. So natural selection pushed us in the direction of needing to do whatever you need to do to survive, get food, live long enough to survive and reproduce. And our ancestors a million years ago, maybe, if they were lucky if they got 1,000 calories a day, right? They probably oftentimes went to sleep hungry, and and so they had to survive, and natural selection pushed those bodies in the direction to survive on less. Is that the thesis?
Yeah, certainly to survive on the minimum amount that they could.
The minimum amount, yeah, exactly.
Our biological systems in many ways are designed to get the most use out of very limited energy. So if you compare like an internal combustion engine to the human body in terms of work performed per energy in, there's no comparison. Human bodies are way more efficient. Internal combustion is very wasteful compared to the complex chemical reactions that underlie our body. That said, just specifically the 1,000 calorie figure, they would have had to eaten more than that. I mean, if you look at calorie intake in hunter-gatherers, it's actually pretty similar to calorie intake in people in affluent nations like the U.S. if you're comparing for the same body size and body composition.
Wow, that's surprising. So they probably got somewhere in the neighborhood of 2,000, 2,500 calories a day.
Yeah, that's right. And and it's and I mean that's just what the human body requires. But to do that, they had to spend hours a day foraging.
Right.
So and then some days maybe they wouldn't get as much as they wanted, and then occasionally they would be able to just stuff their faces to make up for it. And then on balance, they're getting just enough to be like healthy and lean. Mm-hmm. And so there's a certain minimum amount that the human body requires to be functional and healthy, and they were in most cases getting that amount. However, that doesn't mean that they were always getting as much as they wanted. And it is true that, according to the anthropologist I spoke with when I was researching my book, that often if you ask them, "Are you hungry?" they will say yes. And it was at least one of the anthropologists had the opinion that was more meaningful than when we say we're hungry, because, if I say I'm hungry, then maybe that means that I should have had lunch an hour ago. Whereas for them, maybe that means that they only ate half the number of calories that they normally would for that entire day, or didn't get a meal at all. So I think even though on average they were getting enough to remain in good body composition and good health, they didn't always get as much as they wanted, and they would often experience hunger that was probably more meaningful than the hunger that most people experience in the modern U.S.
Right. And yet there was still probably a lot of famine, a lot of people dying ancestors of humans dying of famine periodically and probably in pockets. So fast forward to today, and we have these bodies designed by evolution. Now, what is obviously, if this is something that you spent your life's work on studying this, what's the latest on the empirical evidence behind the negative impacts to a body right? Cancer links, heart disease, hypertension. I'm sure there are information that you're aware of here.
Yeah, so this continues to be debated. So you're asking what are the health impacts of obesity?
Right.
Yeah, so this continues to be debated just how harmful it is. I mean, I think pretty much everyone agrees that it's not good for you, but the degree of harm is continuing to be debated. However, I believe that it is quite harmful. There are a couple of different lines of evidence that we can look at. So the one I think that's most visible when we start thinking about this question are observational studies that have just measured people's body mass index, which is just their weight corrected for height. And then they say, hey, so, we measured 10,000 people's body mass index. Let's see who gets sick and who doesn't, and we'll correlate that with baseline body mass index. Mm-hmm. And when you do that, and you just kind of do it in a really simple way, you see that there's not a really strong correlation between body mass index and health outcomes. However, and they call this the obesity paradox, the fact that we have all of this research from basic science in animal models and randomized controlled trials with short-term outcomes suggesting that it's really not good for you to have excess fat. But then in these big long-term observational studies, we're not really seeing that as much. And the reason, I think, a major reason for that is that these studies may suffer from pretty serious confounding. Mm-hmm. So particularly something called reverse causality, where basically instead of, it's not just obesity making people sick, it's sick people losing weight, and so making being lean look less healthy than it should, because if you have cancer, if you have Alzheimer's disease, if you have diabetes, if you have certain types of cardiovascular disease, many of those actually cause weight loss. And so what you might be seeing is that people who are sick, the relationship is confounded because people who are sick weigh less than they otherwise would if they weren't sick. So it makes being lean look more dangerous than it should. And so when you correct for that, there are a couple different ways to do it that I'll just gloss over for now unless you want to talk about them. When you correct for that, basically obesity starts to look a lot more harmful. So essentially, the more fat you carry on your body, the higher your risk of having a heart attack, the higher your risk of having cancer, higher the risk of having stroke, higher risk of having arthritis is a common one. Right. And the strongest relationship of all is with type 2 diabetes. So type 2 diabetes is exquisitely sensitive to body fatness and calorie intake, in calorie in and out, basically what we call energy balance, the relationship between calories coming in and calories going out and your body fatness. Type 2 diabetes is exquisitely sensitive to that. And so if you reduce someone's calorie intake or increase their physical activity level and you cause them to lose weight a little bit, it doesn't even have to be that much. There are a number of really very high quality, long-term randomized controlled trials with actual real diabetes outcomes that show that substantial, all those things I just mentioned, substantially reduce the risk of progressing to type 2 diabetes. So just to put that another way, we have really, really solid evidence that you can actually prevent type 2 diabetes by reducing calorie intake or increasing expenditure via diet or physical activity. Right. And furthermore, you can actually reverse established type 2 diabetes. This was shown in a trial called the DIRECT trial. It took people with mild type 2 diabetes and showed basically if you put them on a very low calorie diet, 46% of people by the end of a year, so a temporary low-calorie diet for a few months, then maintenance out to a year, 46% of them didn't have diabetes anymore. They were off their medications. Their blood glucose was controlled. They were able to eat carbohydrate like, normally without insulin or anything. And so this shows that, developing diabetes and the maintenance of the diabetic state are exquisitely sensitive to calorie intake. And so, so I just wanted to mention that diabetes is the disease that is most tightly linked to body fatness and energy balance. And that's been shown over and over and over again. And one of the main mechanisms that connects body fatness to these chronic diseases is insulin resistance. So insulin resistance is the primary metabolic factor that underlies type 2 diabetes, and it is also exquisitely sensitive to energy balance and body fatness. And just to make sure everyone is on board with what I'm talking about, insulin resistance is this really important hormone that regulates your blood glucose and your blood fat levels, and kind of is I like to call it a metabolic traffic cop in the body that kind of directs the traffic of different metabolic fuels. And if that's screwed up, if your tissues can't hear insulin very well, if it requires more insulin to get the same metabolic job done, then we call that insulin resistance. And that's kind of what happens to the typical person who's eating the typical diet and not being physically active. Once that person ages somewhat, they're likely going to be insulin resistant. And one of the main causes of that is positive energy balance and excess body fatness. So insulin resistance is exquisitely sensitive to those, and then insulin resistance goes on to cause these other things like diabetes, and probably contributes to cancer risk, and almost certainly contributes to cardiovascular disease risk. And so I think that's a major pathway by which body fatness and calorie intake impacts disease risk. Right. And there's tons of evidence. I just gave a talk on this, so I've got all the evidence in my brain right now, and I won't avalanche people with it, but I just want to say that there's tons of evidence supporting what I just said. Yeah. And it's not speculation at all at this point.
Yeah, and I've seen much of that evidence and the increasing cancer risks, increasing evidence about cancer risks. Yet there, like you said, there are still some folks out there that will try to debate this, and I wanted to get your thoughts on this. I always said if I ever got a chance to talk to you, I'd ask you your opinion on various movements that aim to normalize obesity in the name of various alternative social causes that focus on the political correctness, where some circles are saying you can't even say the word obesity anymore. So what do you make of these movements?
Yeah, it's a challenging situation because, first of all, I absolutely recognize the value of people feeling good about their bodies. And, nothing that I say is intended to guilt trip anyone about their body. I think it's great to want to feel good about your body, no matter what your body looks like. Mm-hmm. I think that sometimes this movement kind of gets into denialism, I would say, about the health impacts of weight. So, in the service of feeling good about themselves, they will kind of deny that there's a connection between body weight and health, or body fatness and health, I should say. And my perspective is, I'm not trying to make anybody feel bad about themselves. That's not my goal, and I would rather not do that, regardless of a person's weight. Right. But and I also, try to treat everyone with respect regardless of their weight. But there are facts that I think we should acknowledge. I think people should have this information to be able to use it and make their own decisions. I don't want people to feel bad, but I do want them to have the information the best information possible. Because, let's say you're convinced by this, that, there's no connection between body fatness and health, and you don't do anything about your body fatness while you could have, and then you end up with type 2 diabetes, or you have a heart attack, or you get severe osteoarthritis in your knees and you can't play with your grandkids. Like, these are real world negative consequences of basically not acknowledging reality, I would say.
Right.
And so, and it's not just about health consequences. Like, it's about your performance and feeling good in life. Like, I think about this, with respect to kids. Like, isn't it just an obvious fact that a child with obesity can't play in the same way as a lean child? Like,
exactly, yeah.
In terms of being on the monkey bars. And I'm not trying to be a jerk here. Like, again, I try to respect people no matter what their weight is. But, I mean, there is a real limitation here. There are real limitations every day that state is imposing on people. And I think that is just a fact. And so...
Yeah, I think what's happening, and we see it in other questions, common questions, right, where people are sort of in echo chambers, and when they're in their echo chambers, they sort of download and install the program to please their in group, and so the code of the program goes something like this: I disagree with the science, or the science makes me feel uncomfortable, therefore I will just ignore the science or try to discredit the science. And that's just, it's not helpful.
Or they have their own alternative interpretation of it.
Right.
But, I understand, like, body image is a profoundly personal thing and a profoundly impactful thing for people. And I think, that's a key part of identity.
Right. And
people get really caught up on things that are involved in their identity. I think this is part of what happens with the acrimony of the diet debates. Is diet is very closely tied in with identity as well.
Right.
And so anytime you have a situation like that, whether it's politics or religion or, body aesthetics or, diet, that really gets to an important piece of a person's identity, there's going to be issues around there in terms of people not necessarily being evidence driven.
Yeah. Now, what about the genetic influence, right? So you had some stuff in your book about the percentage impact of genes on adiposity or body fatness. What information do you have there on that you can share with our listeners?
Yeah, so genetics, and this is another one of these things that's just so well established in the scientific community and that there's very little awareness of. So another one of those things where I feel very lucky to be able to be the person or a person to be able to communicate this. But if you look at twin studies, which are probably the best way to look at the overall genetic contribution to body fatness, what you see, and this is the latest information that I have. This is actually a slight update over what is contained in my book. I found a meta-analysis, which is a study of studies that includes like a large number of these twin studies. I forget how many. It was more than 30, I think. And basically what they find is that about 75% of differences in body fatness between individuals is accounted for by differences in genetics between those individuals. Mm-hmm. So basically genes determine 75% of who's fat and who's not in a country like the US or in European countries or other affluent countries where these studies were done. And so genetics is absolutely huge. And, I think a lot of people are kind of relieved to hear this, and I hope they will be, because the truth is that there are some people that just don't have challenges with their weight naturally. They're not susceptible genetically. And there are other people that are genetically very susceptible and they're going to struggle. And it's not fair, but I think understanding it at least lets people have some compassion for themselves. But I think one thing I need to explain here, the first thing, people always have an objection here, and that is, well, if it's so genetic, then how come our ancestors who had the same genes had much less obesity than us today?
Yeah.
And the answer to that is that you have to understand a little bit about how these studies are done. So they're done in a cross section. So like 1995 United States or 2005 Netherlands. And they're just looking at a cross section of the population. So they're not looking across time. And they're saying what the question they're asking is, in this particular setting right now that these people are living in, how much do genes versus environment contribute to body fatness? So if you have a population that's all living in a fattening environment and all living in a similar fattening environment, most of the variability in body fatness will be accounted for by genes, because pretty much everyone's eating a fattening diet that doesn't differ very much. So you don't have much variability in the environment to explain those differences in body fatness. So, however, if you were to look, across cultures that have dramatically different diets and lifestyles and do the correlation there, you would probably find that the genetic contribution is much lower and the environmental contribution is much higher. Mm-hmm. So those estimates very much depend on the context in which the studies were done.
Right.
However, nevertheless, it does show that in our current context, the world that we're currently living in the United States, for the average group of people, most of the differences in body fatness are explained by genetics. But that does not imply that environment is not important. It does not imply that diet and lifestyle are not important, because if you were to take the average person and put them in a very radically different diet and lifestyle, either, a hunter-gatherer diet and lifestyle, or you were to just put them on, a whole food, lower calorie density diet and have them get physical activity regularly, those would probably cause the average person to become a lot leaner. So the environment still matters a lot.
Right. Yeah. And it makes perfect sense. I mean, 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, a million years ago, we had the same genes, right? So everything that you're saying makes a lot of sense there. So what about the commonly held beliefs that certain nutrients are more fattening than others? So there's all these fad diets out there. I don't really get into them at all, right? But many of them just focus on this idea that focusing on certain macronutrients more than others are fattening than others, other than reasons other than their caloric density. Would you dispel those myths as I try to do the same?
Yeah, so basically there's two different ways that you could look at this, two different angles. And one is, what advice can you give people to help them lose weight? And the other one is, what does the science say about how that actually works? And it is true that if you tell someone to eat less carbohydrate or to eat less fat, they will lose body fat. And so, people will take this and they'll add on this whole mythology to that. Mm-hmm. For example, there's this mythology in the low carb community that it's all about carbohydrate and the only way to lose weight is to eat less carbohydrate, and dietary fat intake and calorie intake are irrelevant. that's kind of an extreme version, but that is a version that is actually advocated by prominent people in that community. So they've taken this piece of advice that actually has value in terms of in real life helping people to lose fat, and they've built this mythology around it that makes the entire world revolve around that nutrient.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of the distinction I'm trying to draw, is that there can be effective advice that just doesn't work the way people say it works. And so this is one of those cases when you actually look at the studies that have compared feeding people the same number of calories differing in fat or carbohydrate content. So just to explain that in a different way, divide people into two groups. Each group is eating the same number of calories. One group is getting a high carb diet. Other group is getting a low carb diet. Fat is making up the difference. And then you let them go for a couple weeks and you see, are there differences that emerge here in their body fatness? And what we find is that, and by the way, there are different levels of control that you can impose here. So there are really tightly controlled studies where we know exactly what people were eating. And then there are not well-controlled studies where we just send them home with advice and they implement it however they want, and we're not measuring things very accurately. So I'm talking about specifically the extremely rigorous studies, we call them metabolic ward studies, where every morsel that enters their mouth is measured and controlled.
Right.
And so those are the studies where we really know what's going on the mechanism level. And so when you look at the data from those studies and you put them together, you pool them in a meta-analysis or study of studies, what you see is that the calorie intake or the calorie value of the diet is by far the main determinant of its effects on body fatness. And in fact, if there is a difference, it mostly favors carbohydrate. So carbohydrate calorie per calorie seems to be slightly less fattening than dietary fat, which actually is not that surprising because dietary fat is very efficiently incorporated into fat tissue, whereas carbohydrate is less efficiently incorporated because, you start with fat, that's already in the form that it needs to be in your fat tissue, right? It just needs to be shuttled.
Right.
If you start with carbohydrate, you have to turn it into fat first. And so metabolically, that's less efficient. I'm sorry, that's actually, what I just said is actually not correct. Because actually carbohydrate, what it does is it spares fat oxidation. So it's still dietary fat that's going into your fat tissue either way. Nevertheless, when you eat carbohydrate, there's a metabolic cost to that is greater than eating fat. And so it kind of makes sense that this would be the case, and it seems to be borne out. But in terms of real-world practical relevance, there is none. It's approximately the same, whether it's fat or carbohydrate. These are very small differences I'm talking about. So basically, when they say, everybody loves to hate on the phrase, a calorie is a calorie. There's a new news story every week that says, a calorie is no longer a calorie. But the truth is, a calorie is still a calorie.
Right.
Approximately speaking. And that's why these stories keep coming out, because the idea never really got debunked. In fact, it's more strongly supported than ever now. So, and you wouldn't know this because there's this kind of churn happening in social media and in the news media. Every new study that comes out, we kind of like to act like that's the only study to ever happen. But if you look at the whole context of the literature, what you see is, again, approximately speaking, a calorie is a calorie as far as we currently know. And now, is there ever going to be a scenario where a calorie is not a calorie? Is there ever going to be a food or a substance or some kind of scenario where that's not true? Yeah, maybe there will be, but we don't have evidence for that right now. What we have evidence for is that varying fat and carbohydrate does not matter for body fatness when calorie intake is kept the same.
Right. So a calorie is a calorie. The first and second law of thermodynamics holds for animate as well as inanimate objects. And a calorie is a calorie. So a calorie is the amount of energy that it takes to heat a liter of water 1 degree. I think that's right. Right. So, and the only way that you lose body fat in the purest sense of thermodynamics is to have caloric deficits. Accumulation of caloric deficits. Right.
That's right. Although, that doesn't necessarily imply that thinking about calories overtly is the best way to create a calorie deficit.
Right. Now, let's get into that, because this is the meat of the book with the brain. So, like you said, that's not where the rubber meets the road. We have this brain in our head that influences our behaviors, and this is the part of the book that really just blew my mind. And so we have a brain. It's approximately 3 pounds, and I think somewhere in there you had written that it's about 2% of our body weight. Yet it demands something like a fifth of the energy demand of the body, or something like that. Mm-hmm. That is that's just, it just blows my mind. So so let's start with the basal ganglia and how that works. Let's talk about that with our listeners, and just let's maybe go through the whole thing with the basal ganglia and the lipostat and the negative feedback loop and leptin, and see if we can just go through all of that in one fell swoop.
All right. Well, I'll start with the basal ganglia. So essentially, you as an organism that can take many different actions at any particular time, you have to have some system for selecting which action to take. Mm-hmm. So, right now I could, twiddle my thumbs. I could get up and walk to the fridge. There's many different things I could do with my body, right? But the best thing for me to be doing at this moment is for me to be doing this interview. And so there has to be a system that allows your brain to select the most appropriate action at any particular time. And a lot of neuroscience researchers believe that this collection of brain regions called the basal ganglia is that system that performs this action selection function. So it's the one that says, no, you shouldn't be getting up and going to the fridge, even though physically and neurobiologically I'm capable of doing that. Mm-hmm. It's the one that's saying, no, don't activate those circuits. This is not the right context. And so basically you have the system that is receiving all of these bids all the time from all the rest of the brain. All the rest of your brain is kind of trying to activate all the different behaviors that you could possibly do, and you have the system that selects the one that's the most appropriate. And so that system, for example, if you're hungry, that system might first select, let's say your body has an energy deficit. You haven't eaten in a while. So that system might decide that the number one priority for you right now is to feel hungry on just kind of a basic motivational level, rather than feeling, hot or cold or wanting sex or whatever the other motivation could be. If you're in an energy deficit, hunger is the best thing. And then it selects between all the different ways that you could satisfy that hunger. So you could, go to the fridge, you could go to the grocery store, you could order a pizza, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so what's the most appropriate for your situation and your needs? And then there's another level of selection that selects the actual physical movements that allow you to perform that action. So there's the motivation, there's the decision-making level, and then there's the actual motor level of selection that's happening via the basal ganglia. And so, so that's the general idea of why we would eat or not eat, or why we would eat one thing and not the other,
And
or
this is
why
all,
we would prefer.
and this is all subconscious, right? And what Daniel Kahneman calls it, the system one, right?
Correct. Yeah, correct. So this is all happening for the most part outside of our conscious awareness. Basal ganglia are truly ancient brain regions. They evolved probably more than 600 million years ago. And pretty much everything that's that old is not conscious in the brain. It's just kind of a hardwired subsystem that's whirring along in the background. So this, action selection is a problem that organisms have been having to solve for almost all of our evolutionary history. And so the basal ganglia are the solution to that, and they've been very effective for the last, several hundred millions of years. And so, so that's that general idea. So do you want me to talk about the lipostat?
Yeah, exactly. Let's go there.
Okay. So the lipostat is a term that we use for the system in the brain that regulates body fatness. So there's data going back all the way to 1839 is the first piece of evidence that I'm aware of, suggesting that the brain plays a really critical role in regulating body fatness. And the way it does that is via what's called a negative feedback loop. This is a really simple, basic engineering concept. And to know how it works, let's consider the home thermostat. So your home thermostat has a thermometer in it that measures the ambient temperature in your house. And what it does is it compares that temperature to the temperature that you set on it. So it compares that to the temperature set point that you entered. So let's say that's 68 degrees. And then if the temperature deviates from that, it kicks in either heat or AC to bring it back to that set point. So that's called a negative feedback circuit, and it exists in many places in engineering and in biology in order to maintain the stability of a particular system. And so in this case, the thermostat is trying to maintain the stability of the temperature in your house. So there are many negative feedback loops in the human body, including for temperature itself. But one of those feedback loops regulates body fatness as well. And the way this works is that your brain measures the amount of fat on your body using a hormone called leptin. Leptin is secreted by body fat, and it circulates in your blood proportionally to the amount of fat that you have. So the more fat you have, the more leptin you have, and your brain is constantly measuring that, and it's comparing it to a sort of internal set point for body fatness. So if you try to lose weight and your body fat level starts to decline, your brain says, hey, wait a minute, just like your thermostat would if the temperature was dropping, your brain says, hey, wait a minute, no, that's lower than what I want, and it will start kicking in responses to bring your body fat back up to what it was. And I call that the starvation response because that's what it is, and it is an intuitive term to think about what it is. But basically, it makes you hungrier. It increases your responsiveness to food cues. So, maybe you didn't used to pay attention to the ice cream aisle in the grocery store, and now you do. It increases your motivational drive. Foods taste better, and you have more cravings. And it also reduces your energy expenditure. So your metabolic rate actually will go down. And all of those things together serve to bring more energy into your body and allow less energy to escape, thus putting more energy back in your fat tissue. And that will continue until you have regained the fat and your leptin goes back up, and then your brain says, okay, we're good. And the thing that is tough about this, the thing that's really unfortunate, is that this system operates in lean people and people with obesity, so people of all levels of body fat. And so people with obesity actually appear to have a higher set point. And so their brains don't want them to lose fat any more than a lean person's brain wants him to lose fat.
Right.
And so then you get this problem where weight loss is very challenging. People start losing weight and then they get hungry and eventually they go back to their old eating habits and they regain the weight.
And this is the biggest loser effect, and the reason why almost all of the biggest losers contestants have gained it all back, probably because of that negative feedback loop.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, because I think that's a really great example. If you look at the follow-ups that have been done of the people who went through the biggest loser, I mean, these people often are losing over 100 pounds, are losing the majority of their fat tissue. And then if you follow up with them a couple of years later, they've regained most, if not all, of that fat. So, I mean, it's obviously harder, it's much harder to lose fat from obese to lean and maintain that than it is to start off lean and maintain that. Mm-hmm. Because in the former case, you're fighting against the lipostat, and in the latter case, you're not. Your lipostat is at the set point it wants. So this is really, I think this is one of the really key things that people responded to after reading my book. I got a lot of messages from people saying, wow, I finally feel like my struggles with weight are explained. Like, finally, I understand that I'm not just weak-willed, that this is how I'm wired, that, you know, regaining weight is kind of what my brain is pushing me to do on a non-conscious level.
Right.
So, so I think it's really important for people to understand, and not to be discouraging. You know, I don't want people to think that they can't lose fat, but I think people need to understand what they're up against, because it's literally you are doing something that some parts of your brain may not want you to do, and you might encounter some resistance.
Right. And we work with a lot of endurance athletes who are very highly motivated, especially the competitive and performance-driven athletes. And we see this all the time, where athletes will purposely race underweight, calling it their quote-unquote race weight, because they figured out that marathons, triathlons, Ironman, it's all about power to weight ratio. And so they will train down to some weight, but realize very quickly that they can't maintain it in the off season. And I've definitely seen that. And so it's even in competitive, highly motivated athletes, it's the same thing. Your body just has that body fat set point that it will try to defend vigorously.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing.
Interesting.
So we're at an hour, so I want to be sensitive to your time. So how about we finish up with, so at the end of your book, I think it's your chapter 11, you have basically these 6 steps. These 6 steps to managing obesity. But when I read them, I said, you know, these 6 steps could just as well be for an endurance athlete, for anyone. So how about we finish up and go through those in summary form?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first thing I want to start off with is just to say that I wrote my book for kind of the average person who's interested in body weight and health. And I think that there are, you know, I'm sure you're well aware of this, that there are certain additional factors and complexities that apply specifically to endurance athletes and other high-level athletes.
Right.
And, you know, sometimes a lot of the people who I know in that community are not really struggling with excess body fatness. It's more like they're not getting enough calories in and not, you know, eating enough to avoid overtraining. And so it's kind of the opposite problem. So I just want to take a moment to recognize that,
of course,
endurance athletes are not necessarily going to be the same as the average person looking to lose some weight. And And that's more who this is targeted toward.
Right.
So with that context, so I think the number one thing that people, if you just want one concept, it's to fix your food environment. So that means the food and the food cues that surround us. These are things that it's one of the main factors that pushes us to consume too much. So for example, in your kitchen, if you have tempting foods laying around, the sight, the smell, the setting, those things will push you to eat when you don't necessarily need to eat. Same thing at work. Seeing food advertisement on television, seeing food advertisement on billboards. The average U.S. adult sees, I think, about 20 food ads per day from TV alone. So cleaning up your food environment, creating a positive, supportive food environment that naturally favors the consumption of the foods that support you and disfavors the consumption of foods that don't support your goals, I think is kind of the number one step that people need to take. And I think the food environment is a big reason why we got into this problem in the first place in a country like the United States.
Mm-hmm.
The second thing is to manage your appetite. So essentially, if your brain thinks you're starving, you're going to have problems achieving your weight management goal.
Right.
And so there's certain ways that you can essentially create more satiety, create more fullness from the foods that you're eating without eating more calories. So a couple of things that you can do are to eat foods that are a lower calorie density. Mm-hmm. So foods that have fewer calories per gram. So just to give you a couple examples, like very low calorie density food would be most vegetables. Very high, the highest would be just straight up oil.
Right.
So, and then there's a whole spectrum in between, but keeping it on the lower end of the spectrum, which usually means avoiding, refined, highly processed foods, avoiding added sugars, avoiding added fats, that will help you get more satiety per calorie from the food that you're eating. Basically, your stomach is more full with fewer calories.
Right.
Eating food that's higher in fiber, higher in protein, and eating food that's not too palatable. So food that is really highly palatable, that's super delicious, pushes us to eat too much.
Right.
So keeping it more moderate, and again, that comes back to avoiding these highly processed foods and avoiding too much added fats and sugars and that sort of thing. So those things that I just discussed will help you get more satiety per calorie.
Right.
Number 3 is to beware of food reward. So food reward is this property of foods that pushes us to eat. Basically, it's cravings or food seductiveness would be two intuitive ways to put it. So certain foods obviously are more seductive than others, more crave-worthy. Ice cream gets people a lot more excited than plain lentils or celery sticks or
right.
foods like that. And that relates to the physical and chemical properties of those foods, of course. And so food that is very, very seductive, not only is it less filling per calorie, but it also seems to increase the set point of the lipostat. So it makes your body want to hold on to more fat. So I think that to the extent we're able, it helps to eat simpler foods.
Right. Just
simpler, more unrefined foods like how our ancestors would have eaten. Not only will you get more satiety per calorie, but it's not going to trigger your lipostat in the same way to make you want to defend a higher level of body fatness and take in more food. Basically, it just makes it a lot easier for you to eat an appropriate amount of calories.
Got it. Yep.
And then make sleep a priority. That's number 4. So I review research in my book suggesting that insufficient quantity or quality of sleep can increase calorie intake and body fatness. And so, that's one where I would say the research is not quite as ironclad. However, I think it probably does matter. So getting enough sleep, getting enough high quality sleep, controlling your light exposure. such that you're getting bright full spectrum light during the day, especially in the morning, and then not getting it at night, can be helpful. Number 5 is move your body. Pretty self-explanatory.
Right.
This is physical activity. You're increasing your calorie expenditure, and it's also, I believe that regular physical activity is just a kind of maintenance task for the body and the brain included. So if you're getting regular physical activity, all of your body systems are just going to work better, and your lipostat is probably going to work better. It's probably going to defend a somewhat leaner body weight. So that's another thing that can be helpful. Mm-hmm. Not to mention, I just think physical activity is really important for physical and cognitive performance and maintaining that as we age.
Right.
And then number 6 is to manage stress. So stress is something that can cause us to eat more, and it can probably also do damage to us metabolically if it's too great and too sustained. And so finding ways to ideally reduce your stress level, or if you're not able to do that, to de-stress in ways that are more constructive than eating comfort food or overeating comfort food, such as, taking a hot bath or having sex or gardening, calling a friend. Those are kind of alternative ways to achieve some stress-busting impact without having detrimental effects on your waistline and health.
And what do you think the stress reduction delta would be on gardening and sex?
I think that probably depends on the person, but I will say that it's pretty tough to compete with delicious food in terms of stress-busting effect. So I think that's part of the problem is, it's just digging into some ice cream is so easy and so satisfying.
Is the stress thing part of that hunter-gatherer thing where if you're stressed and running from a lion or whatever, your body is just going to react in a way to try to, again, save your life, stockpile calories so that you can survive?
So I'm not sure. I know that people have kind of drawn a distinction between acute and chronic stress. So some people have argued, that our ancestors experienced chronic stress, like running away from a bear or getting into a fight, but not really so much chronic stress. So, like trying to meet a deadline, right, or, not being able to make ends meet financially, or whatever the chronic stresses are that we currently have in our lives. I don't know if I buy that argument, honestly. I mean, our ancestors had tons of things to be stressed about chronically. I mean, right. You had, in agricultural societies, often there was a threat of starvation. Right. Many non-industrial cultures were in constant chronic low-level warfare with one another. So, you never knew when the neighboring tribe guy was going to try to stab you or your family. Yeah, you're probably right. Yeah. Yeah, and then predation, disease, infant mortality was 30%, 30%. So they had tons to be stressed out about. So I'm not sure I really buy that argument, but that is how some people have conceptualized it.
But you're right. I mean, some people respond differently to stress. Some people, just don't eat. They stop eating when they're super stressed in many respects. So, but
yeah, that's right. It does vary quite a bit individually. So thanks for mentioning that.
All right. Well, this has been amazing. So I will post the link to the book in the show notes. Where could people find you out in the public sphere?
Yeah, so I'm most active on Twitter. I tweet out a lot of studies. I discuss things with researchers. Some of it's pretty technical, some of it's not. So that's where I'm most active. I also have a website, stephanguyenet.com, or if you don't feel like spelling that, you can go to wholehealthsource.org. And then my book would be the main other thing.
All right. The book is called The Hungry Brain. You have to pick it up. You have to read it. And thanks, Dr. Guyenet, for coming on the podcast.
Okay, thanks for having me, Tony.
A big thanks to Dr. Stephan Guyenet for lending us his time. Send all of your comments about this podcast on obesity to contact@EventHorizon.tv. I'm curious to get your thoughts and feedback. We have some great podcasts coming up. Next, we have Professor Daniel Lieberman of Harvard. If that name sounds familiar, it should. His work on running was popularized in the book Born to Run by Christopher McDougall. He has a broad research agenda relating to the origin of the human body, and he's often tapped by documentaries to speak and appear. You can see him right now on the Netflix documentary, The Evolution of Us, also coming up on the podcast, and I'm very excited about this. The marathon woman herself, the legend, Catherine Switzer, the woman who shook the foundation of marathon running and became the first woman to officially run the Boston Marathon. You don't want to miss either of these. So please follow, like, and subscribe. And if you enjoy the podcast and want to support it, you can go to patreon.com/endurance.
Follow Event Horizon Endurance Sport on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter for training programs and services. To become a member of our Endurance Institute or for a complete archive of podcasts, log on to our website, EventHorizon.tv.